Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest webinar from the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice and the ABA Commission on Hispanic Legal Rights and Responsibilities. We are thrilled to bring you today's program entitled Census 2020, What Lawyers with Inquiring Clients Should Know About Confidentiality and Other Issues. I'll begin today with a few housekeeping items. This program is offering 1.5 hours of general CLE credit. In order to obtain this credit, you must have attended the webinar for the full duration, and you must submit the CLE verification code via Qualtrics survey. This code will be announced several times during the program. At the end of the webinar, the evaluation survey will be circulated via the chat feature and via email to all registrants. Also worth mentioning is the setup of our new webinar platform. As an attendee, you should see the below control panel, including audio options, chat, raise hand, and Q&A. For the purposes of this webinar, we ask that you submit all questions through the Q&A, and the panelists will answer them at the end of the program. If you do not see these controls, please make sure you tap your screen and move your mouse. If you have any questions or concerns, please respond directly to any of your confirmation or reminder emails, and I will respond in a timely manner. And with that, I'll open it up to the panelists to begin their discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And welcome everyone to this important webinar about Census 2020. Our goal today is to provide you with information about the census and to provide you with further information about some of the legal requirements that surround the census to enable you to answer any questions that may come up from your clients, from your neighbors and friends, or from family members. We expect in this census, particularly because of the attention the issue has received so far, that folks may have questions as they receive the first communications from the Census Bureau, directing them to go online and fill out the survey on behalf of their household. We expect that lawyers may be among the first people to receive some of these questions, whether from clients, regardless of the practice area in which you serve, from neighbors and family members as well. We're fortunate today to have a distinguished panel of what I would call census nerds. One of us is a full-time professional census nerd, and two of us are more sideline census nerds. But we know a great deal about the census and we're prepared to answer your questions. Before I turn it over to our first presenter, I do want to point out some of the initial challenges we face in this census year. It's first of all appropriate that we're meeting this week because this week is the week when the first set of letters or postcards will go out across the country directing folks to go online and fill out the census survey on behalf of their household. Census Day is actually April 1st of 2020. We face a number of challenges this year in particular. First, I'll point out that every other census, and this is one of them, coincides with a presidential election, which means in the midst of all of the politicking going on in the primary season and moving into the general election campaign, we'll have important census activities occurring, and households will be asked to participate in the census by filling out the questionnaire on behalf of their household. We can expect in this controversial presidential election year that politics may intrude on some of what occurs with respect to the census. Second, in Census 2020, we have perhaps the highest level of awareness prior to the census beginning of any census in the past. And that is primarily because of attention directed to the census issues over the course of at least the last year, largely because of an attempt by Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross to add an untested citizenship question to Census 2020. It's important to note, and we'll repeat it throughout, there is now no citizenship question on Census 2020. The Supreme Court majority concluded that Commerce Secretary Ross had not provided a sufficient public rationale for including the question. Therefore, the first answer you should give if anyone comes to you concerned about a citizenship question on Census 2020 is that there is no citizenship question on the questionnaire. This attention from the inclusion or potential inclusion of a citizenship question has certainly raised awareness of Census 2020 to a perhaps unprecedented level this early in the census year, but it also means that some of that attention has focused on potential fears, trepidations, concerns about participating. I would say the third challenge I'll identify before introducing our first speaker is that this is the first time that we will have a majority digital census in our entire history. That means the Census Bureau expects the vast majority of households to fill out their questionnaire online. That means going online using a desktop or a portable computer or even a smartphone to participate in filling out the census form for your household. You can understand in this day and age that that raises additional concerns for some folks who may come to you with some of those concerns about participating in the census. As you'll learn, there are alternative ways of participating and filling out the required household questionnaire for Census 2020. With that introduction of those three initial concerns, I want to turn it over to the professional full-time census nerd with us, someone we're very pleased that in this very busy time has taken this hour and a half to appear with us on this webinar. He is the Associate Director of Operations at the Census Bureau, so you can understand this is both the most exciting time of the decade for him, but perhaps a particularly nerve-wracking time of the decade as well. But we're very pleased to have with us the Associate Director of Operations at the Bureau, Tim Olson. Tim will go over with us some of the basics of what you will see in Census 2020 as the months go by. Tim.
Tom, thank you so much. You're right. This is kind of a busy time right now for us, and but I'm honored to be here with all of you and everybody who's listening in as participants. So I'm going to switch over to my slide. Make sure I can find it here. Okay, thank you. So a little technical difficulty here. As I begin my portion, I've been asked to share what the CLE code is for this session. So if you're listening in and you want to jot this down, it is and again, the CLE code for this session is so. In my very short, brief remarks, I just want to share with you what I think many of you already know is how important the census is, and the fact that the numbers that come out of the census will literally affect everybody in this nation for the next decade. It certainly affects how we are represented in the U.S. Congress. I will also add that it will affect the makeup of the Electoral College, which will, in effect, elect our president in the 2024 and the 2028 presidential election, which is certainly a big deal. Also, it will affect the redistricting within each state for their, not only their state legislative districts, but also oftentimes large cities, counties, etc., school district, legislative districts, etc., will be affected by the numbers. So it affects how we are represented literally for a decade. Secondly, and this is what gets the heartstrings of regular folks, the numbers coming out of the census determine the allocation of hundreds of billions of dollars in federal funds every year. A census estimate of the value of that per year is $675 billion. There's other very credible estimates that say it can be as high as $1.5 trillion every single year. Whatever the number is, I just know it's a lot of money. And the monies, the federal funds based on the census data are allocated for school funding, healthcare programs, Medicaid, transportation, job creation, senior services, and many, many other basic things that all of us rely upon in the course of our lives. So when you think about representation and you think about resources, I think and I believe that participating in this census in 2020, it may be the most important thing any person will do for the next decade. There's a lot of challenges in achieving an accurate count, and yet, and this is my fourth census, the message is still pretty incredibly simple. The census is important. Particularly this census, it's very easy to participate. And an incredibly important message for everybody listening to this is that the census is safe. Title 13 of the United States Code mandates the confidentiality of all individual census responses for 72 years. This confidentiality provision of Title 13 it has consistently been upheld in the courts. When it comes to the Patriot Act, post 9/11, even with that particular act, Title 13 was deemed to be sacred, and any of the personal information within the census records could not be shared, even in light of the Patriot Act. So other folks can probably talk more in detail from the legal angle, but I can tell you from the Census Bureau and the legal side of how we operate, individual responses cannot be shared with any other entity outside of the Bureau. That includes immigration authorities, that includes FBI, IRS, local code enforcement, business associations. That individual data cannot be shared or revealed. Let me go into the easy part of the census. As Tom mentioned, literally in 2 days from today's date, and right now it is May 10th, 2020. So starting March 10th, 2020, get my month right, in 2 days on the 12th, we will begin mailing and hand delivering invitations to every household in the nation to self-respond to the census. And when they receive their invitations, literally starting in 2 days, less than 2 days, people can respond. We urge them to go online to our secured site. It's available 24/7, not only in English, but also 12 non-English languages for people to respond. They can also call our toll-free phone numbers. And these are similar to the online response in that their live operators are available to take the interview in English and also the 12 non-English languages. Subsequently, starting in the early part of April, those addresses and urge them to, they can still go online, they can still go by phone, but if they prefer the paper form, they can respond that way. We are expecting approximately 60.5% of US households will self-respond sometime before the end of April. Starting in early May, a census taker will be going to designated addresses in their neighborhood to follow up with non-responding addresses. So one of the messages that we are really sharing right now, particularly in light of what's going on in the nation concerning the virus, we are urging people, if they don't want to be contacted in person by a census taker, simply self-respond now. It's very simple. So what questions do we ask? On the form, and I've just boiled this down in a simple way. We want to know how many persons are living in one's house, apartment, or mobile home. It's a number. Then we want to know the names. And for each individual, we want to know their relationship to person one, the householder, whether they are a husband, a wife, unmarried partner, same-sex spouse, a child, a grandparent, a friend, a roommate, or other. There's several options on there. Then we want to know their sex, male or female, the age of each person. For each person, are they of Hispanic origin? What is their race? And for each address, is it owned or rented? What we don't ask on the questionnaire for 2020, as Thomas said, we do not ask citizenship. We do not ask one's social security number. We do not ask for banking or credit card information. And we do not ask for political donations. That's a highlight of what we do and what we don't ask on the form. It's pretty simple. It takes the average person, a couple person household, 8 to 10 minutes. Very, very simple. So let me go on to the next slide here. And this is where I want to talk about all of the outreach that is going on right now to motivate the population to participate in the census. There's two major components. One is our paid advertising campaign. We began this in January of 2020 with paid advertising, television, radio, print, social media, and out of home, things like billboards, signage, etc. The advertising is in English, in 12 non-English languages. The tagline of the campaign is "Shape Your Future, Start Here." Right now, because the self-response phase is literally about to begin in a matter of less than 2 days, people throughout the United States will begin to see an incredible saturation of the advertising. It will go up incrementally, and the goal is that every person becomes, number one, aware of the census. Number two, they realize how important it is to their future and their community's future for the decade coming up. And thirdly, to know how safe the census is. It's confidential. Now, in addition to advertising, we have an incredible outreach going on with complete count committees. These are independent entities that have been established on their own, almost 11,000 cities, tribes, state government, community organizations. They are actively getting the word out to their communities about participating in the census. In addition, as of this morning, there's almost 330,000 organizations that are actively partnering with the Census Bureau and implementing their own plans to motivate people to participate in the census. Schools, faith-based leaders, using social media, trusted voices, both national and local, a lot of special events going on, highly visible census messaging within communities in high visibility locations. A lot's going on. Let me move on. What should you expect during the next several months? We've talked about advertising. We haven't mentioned, but the very first person in the nation was counted on January 21st of this year in Tooksuk Bay, Alaska. We do rural Alaska earlier than the rest of the nation just because of accessibility issues. We need to be in each village prior to spring breakup. We haven't talked about the peak recruiting that we have been doing since starting last fall, but as of a few days ago, we have actually received 2.7 million applicants that have applied for temporary census jobs. They're in our system, and we've already begun the selection process for approximately 500,000 temporary part-time census employees. That started this past Saturday. We've mentioned the invitation letters that are going out starting a day and a half from now on March 12th. There will be multiple pieces of invitation that go to every household. Census Day is April 1st. The self-response phase, of course, is literally going to start in a matter of a day and a half. You can watch online and see the level of self-response at every geographic level in the country starting March 20th, from the national self-response rate down to the census tract level, about 4,000 persons in each tract. You can watch that, you can see what's happening, you can see areas that are having high self-response and areas that are having low self-response. Wherever you live, look to see how your self-response in your neighborhood's going. If it's doing great, give an applause to your neighbors and say, we're doing great, let's even do better. If you're living in a neighborhood where self-response is kind of low, do what you can. Go on your different social media platforms, urge your neighbors, let's get it done, folks. Let's get it done. Let's self-respond to the census so nobody has to come knocking on our door. The next thing you will see publicly is this huge non-response follow-up operation that starts, generally it starts in early May. We'll complete that by mid-July of this year. About 500,000 temporary workers will be in the neighborhoods contacting households that have not self-responded. During that time, it's the largest peacetime mobilization anywhere in the US that occurs during this period. You will see unemployment numbers change. You will see the employed numbers change at a national level. We literally are deploying on the ground almost 500,000 people, and they're federal employees sworn with an oath to protect the confidentiality of everything they see and hear throughout the course of their job. And that oath lasts their entire life, and it's a big deal. By the end of December of this year, we will be ready to release to the president and to the American people the actual national population count of the United States, as well as state level counts. And these, of course, are the numbers that determine how many members of Congress each state will have in the U.S. House of Representatives for the next decade. But by the end of March of 2021, we will release block level data to the states, and then they begin that process of redistricting and redrawing their congressional districts. So a lot's happening. You're going to see a lot going on, and pretty big time. I've listed here some useful resources online that you can look at your convenience. I want to highlight two of them. The second item, promotional materials in multiple languages. Feel free to look there. There's a lot of great stuff. And if you want to help spread the word in your community, please do. And then also the bottom hyperlink, near real-time self-response data, begins March 20th. You can click there. You will currently see the 2010 self-response rates at all levels of geography throughout the nation in a Google type map. And starting March 20th, you will see actual live self-response percentages in all of those areas. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Tim. Let me ask you a couple of questions, if you don't mind, before we move on. So Tim, there used to be a long form, but what you went over was just a very short number of questions about each household. Can you talk a bit about the long form and why folks won't see it?
Tom, thank you for the question. So in prior censuses, prior to, I believe up through Census 2000, we had a long form and a short form. And the short form went to about 5 out of 6 households, and 1 out of 6 households got this long form, which was much bigger and longer than the short form. We've since changed our methodology, and now the long form is what is called the American Community Survey. And it's a sampling of the US population, about 3.5 million households throughout the year, every year. And each month, 1/12 of that sample receives the American Community Survey. We ask them to self-respond. That survey produces the really rich, detailed demographic and economic information for households down to the tract level. It's still part of the census, though we do it every single month of every single year with a relatively small sample. The short form is what we now what I have been describing, the 2020 census.
Great. So participating in 2020 means that short form only.
Correct.
So Tim, my second question is, it's really, we use language like you'll be invited to fill out the census form, but there's actually a legal obligation to participate. Is that right?
That is correct. The decennial census is a mandatory census by law. So every household is required to participate. And we know from experience that it's important to let people know that. It's not an optional response. We also know from research and experience that though it is mandatory and it is required, we are more successful in gaining cooperation by emphasizing the benefits to one's community and the importance of the numbers.
So Tim, my last set of questions just relate to the fact that it is households, not individuals, that respond to the census. So if a household wishes to respond online, will they be required to provide a number that they've been given by the Bureau? Will there be something that ensures that you know that it's a particular household that is responding?
So two things, Tom. One, the invitation letters we mail or deliver to each household. Within each individual letter, there's a unique census ID, a series of numbers. When someone goes online, for example, they'll be prompted to enter that code, if you will, and that will tie their response directly to the address that they reside at. Now, unlike any prior census, this time people can also respond without that ID, and then they need to enter in the online response form their address. And in the back end, we will match up their response to the address that's in our GIS system. If there's any conflict with not being able to match it to an existing address in our system, that will prompt some follow-up either over the phone or with an in-person visit.
So my last question, Tim, also relates to households. It turns out we learned in 2010 that a significant part of the undercount, because there's always an undercount, related to households responding but leaving certain people out, namely the youngest children from 0 to 4 from their household listing. Could you talk a bit about how important it is to include every person residing in the household as of April 1st?
Yeah, Tom, I appreciate that prompting. Every census we analyze through a separate vehicle exactly what the undercount is within different population groups and age categories and male and female, etc. There's always an undercount among some groups and there's a slight overcount among other groups. In 2010 and in most prior censuses, the most undercounted age grouping was, as you mentioned, those aged 0 through 4. There's a lot of different reasons we think is primarily related to complex households where a young child may be in a shared custody situation between one parent and another parent, or a parent and a grandparent, or they may be in foster care. Lots of different things that cause this. We are urging people in the 2020 census, when they respond to the census, we ask them to include every person who resides at that address. And the rule of thumb is every person who lives or sleeps most of the time at their address should be included on the form. It doesn't matter if it's a related person or an unrelated person. If they live or sleep at one's address, most of the time, that's where they should be counted, including young children.
Thank you very much, Tim. We have a number of questions already popping up, but we're going to turn to our second presenter, who is one of my favorite non-Bureau census nerds, extremely knowledgeable about the census. She's been involved for quite some time as a member of the National Advisory Committee of the Census Bureau on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations, and is as knowledgeable as an outsider can probably be. And she will go over some of the messaging about the census and some of the most appropriate concerns that you may hear from clients and others about the census. My great pleasure to now turn to the Director of Voting and Census Programs at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, Terry Al Minnis. Terry.
Thank you, Tom. Just had to unmute myself. Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you to everybody for being here, and thank you for including me. I am going to go over some of the information that has been shared that can help people understand where the average person is with respect to the 2020 census. So census messaging research had been conducted both by the Census Bureau as well as some outside groups such as Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, for particular communities. And I think that it was pretty clear that across the board that a number of points were pretty consistent, regardless of which community was being tested and who the testing party was. So from the Census Bureau's research, it became clear that fewer than 7 in 10 householders said that they had intended to fill out the census form. But as Tim mentioned, that isn't shared fairly or equally across different communities, particularly communities that are considered hard to count. So some of the communities that were had even higher numbers of people saying that they were not intending to fill out the census form included those who were younger, those who were less educated, and in fact, Asian Americans, I believe, was the group least likely to participate in the 2020 census, and then also American Indian Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. Another point that was loud and clear was that many people were simply unfamiliar with the census and misconceptions about its purpose and processes. Now, clearly, this is a lot of what the advertising and all the engagement that Tim was talking about is meant to try to address this point. But again, we saw those who were younger, less educated, and Asian Americans tended to be less familiar with the census. In fact, in the messaging research that we conducted, we found that more than 50% of Asian Americans actually thought citizens were the only ones who were supposed to fill out the census. And as a community that is highly immigrant, right, where we had over 90% of our communities either non-citizens or those born in a country not the U.S. or children of people who were immigrants, this was very problematic and concerning for us. So the messaging research also showed that there were a number of points that were actual barriers to participation. One was concerns about data privacy and confidentiality. This was particularly true for communities of color. Fear of repercussions, right, fallout from the first point, that is, if data were shared, then there would be repercussions for that data coming out. And this was particularly true for Asian American, though households that were limited English proficient and those that were foreign born. Generally, there's high distrust in all levels of government, and probably among the highest that we've seen in a very long time, if not ever. Also, a concern that there was just a lack of efficacy of participating in the census, right? So I think we saw that if in the Census Bureau's research that young people were the least likely to believe that participating actually mattered, right? That when we talk about benefits of participating, all the reasons that Tim talked about, participating about the benefits that can accrue, whether it's political power, resources to the community and the like, young people were just less likely to believe that it mattered. We also heard about in messaging research that was conducted by Color of Change in the African American community in their focus groups, that was a theme that came up often, sort of, hey, I participated before and I didn't actually see any benefits come to my community. My community is still suffering, we're still lacking in this or that. So that is something that is a little bit a tougher nut to crack, right, than just a lack of awareness or education. And then the last point also similarly, even when there was a belief that completing the census could benefit the community, people didn't really believe that it would benefit them individually. So the messaging research also probed onto motivators to participation, right? So similar to other censuses, it really is around the benefits, the resources that could accrue from participating, right? Funding for public services was the most popular motivator. So this is, these are things like hospitals, fire departments, police departments, as well as roads and highways. Interesting to note, civil rights enforcement was was the second most important to those being in the messaging research done by the Census Bureau. Community-oriented motivators were most popular with younger people, communities of color, limited English proficient persons, and those who were less educated. One thing I think that was just also important to note, certainly from the message research that we did, was that the positive and messaging of motivators were more effective than, say, more negative messaging. So that was something that I think also was borne out through the different research. So some of the key takeaways for census messaging is that there is a need to raise awareness of the 2020 census and how it works, going along with the advertisement that's currently happening. I think also everything that we can do individually to help people understand that the census is coming, that it's important to participate, how it works, and why we should all participate is important. But also equally important is really helping people address their concerns with respect to confidentiality and the distrust in government. We also need to be aware that when we're messaging about the legal protections, as Tim has shared with us, it's also important to tie that in with the benefits so that people both understand that even perhaps there might be some distrust in the government, perhaps there's concern about confidentiality, and here are the reasons why census data are so protected, and also why they're so critical, and why it's important that individuals, participate so that their community, their family are fairly counted, and that their community is accurately reflected and gets their fair share of resources. One thing that was interesting to note across some of the messaging research that we conducted was that there generally was a preference for paper form and the online option. Now, we don't know, maybe because of the current situation we find ourselves, people might be more inclined to participate over the phone, right? So you're avoiding the contact of somebody coming to your door, even if you don't have access to broadband in the same way as others might. So it'll be interesting to see if, the messaging could switch to a little bit of a stronger push around the phone option, even though we knew that generally people previously weren't as keen to participate using the phone. I think it's interesting to know too that the phone, of course, also provides additional language support that actually wouldn't even be achieved through the paper form. Again, the top messaging evokes the use of family and resources and focuses on the benefits and not the negatives, as I said. Also interesting to note that some messaging actually works for some segments, and whether that means certain communities or a subsegment of certain communities. Here are some messaging that works for some, but not all. Resistance as a message, right? Conversations around the citizenship question and concerns about what impact that has on particularly immigrant communities, communities of color. One messaging frame that could be used is to say, the citizenship question was an attempt to erase our community's visibility in this country, and that participating is a way to resist that effort to erase our presence, right? But again, it's a message that works for some communities and not others. For example, when we did our messaging research in the Asian American community, that message played well in California and it played well in New York. But for the Asian American focus groups that we held in other parts of the country, it did not resonate with people. People found it to be too aggressive. And so that's something that I think, locally, you will have the best pulse as to what does or doesn't work. Similarly, visibility was a very strong message for Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders and some of the smaller Asian subgroups, because for them that is sort of, they often feel invisible in the conversations. And so here's an opportunity to say we can make our community count and we can be stand up and be heard. And finally, just to note that one of the things around the advertising that the Census Bureau is doing that Tim mentioned that I think was a great step forward was really having very diverse commercials, right? Whether that's diversity across race and ethnic lines, across generational lines, across different jobs. It was clear that these advertisements were meant to evoke community and inclusivity of everybody participating in the census. And frankly, that was a preference that we saw from our community and the Asian American community when we did our message testing, was really this idea of wanting to be yes, wanting to see themselves and to be able to identify themselves, but to do so in the context of the greater community. Here, I'm going to stop for a second just to reiterate again the CLE code. It is and that is what you need to get your CLE credit. Moving on, I do want to share some additional census resources from national groups to complement the information that Tim had shared. For the Asian American community, our website is countusin2020.org, and we have a slew of materials, including in-language materials on our website. For the African American community, there are 3 different websites that are focused on increasing or improving the count in the African American community, one from Color Change, one from the National Urban League, and one from the NAACP. For the Arab American community, the website is yallahcountmein.org, being hosted by the Arab American Institute. For the Latino community, it's okay, I'm not even gonna butcher the words because I know I always do, but that's, thank you. That is being hosted by Naleo, and Native American community also has 3 websites that are being hosted by the National Congress of American Indians, Native American Rights Fund, the National Urban Indian Coalition, and finally we have a Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander site attached to our site, countusin2020.org/NHPI, that's being hosted by EPIC, Empowering Pacific Islander Communities. And there's also a sort of umbrella census resource, if you will, censuscounts.org. It's a campaign from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Not only will it link to the resources that I shared in the previous slide, but there are also resources from the business community, disability community, immigrant community, faith-based families with young children, the LGBTQ community, and more. So that is sort of a comprehensive resource hub. Just wanted to quickly show the available translations, materials that we'll have in these languages. It is rather not comprehensive because there are a lot more that we could be doing, but we are very proud to be able to share fact sheets and the like in these languages. And then finally, I did want to note addressing the concerns that have been raised both by speakers as well as some of you all through the questions, an acknowledgement, right, that people are scared, are concerned, and have questions about the census. So there are 4 census hotlines that have been set up. One by the Arab American Institute that is providing support in both English and Arabic. We also are hosting a hotline that is covering 8 Asian languages plus English. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law has a census protection hotline, and Laleo is hosting one in Spanish. So the idea with the hotlines, of course, is that they will run through July 2020, the end of NRFU, as Tim mentioned. We have a mixture of live operators responding in real time, as well as voicemail messages being returned within a day or 2. And we and the groups from the previous slide are coordinating regarding FAQs, training, rapid response, and the like. And really, these hotlines are meant to address any questions that people have, whether it's very basic one-on-one questions that what is this, why should I participate, what is this question actually asking me, all the way to, you know, maybe raising questions about, I saw this happening, I think I saw some type of malfeasance happening, for us to be able to follow up and address. And in some ways, recognizing that this is information that the Census Bureau is sharing. But one thing that came through loud and clear through our messaging research was this idea that it's not just the message, but it's the messenger that matters, right? And so for those for whom there's a large amount of distrust for the federal government, unfortunately, the Census Bureau isn't going to be the right messenger for some of this information. And that is why we have these resources available to help supplement and sort of create that echo chamber for the information that the Census Bureau is addressing. So I'm going to now turn this over. Oh, that's just a pretty graphic that my comms team made that I like to share for our hotline. And then I am now turning this over to Tom in 1 second, because I did find a couple of additional cool graphs that I just wanted to share with you all, kind of indicating how the trust in government has really decreased over time. And then just a graph to show how concerned people are about the confidentiality of their answers, right? And no surprise, the largest gaps in concern about confidentiality were about the confidentiality of answers were across the across race and ethnic lines, those education, lower education, age, and level of English proficiency. And now I'm turning it over to you, Tom, to talk about what we're trying to do to address those concerns.
Thank you, Terry. As you all are probably aware, there is a heightened level of distrust in government that we are experiencing today. So we have found that unfortunately, even after folks are informed about the very strong protections on census data confidentiality in Title 13, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment, sometimes folks don't trust that that law will be followed. I will tell you, I am very confident that that law, as ironclad as it is, will in fact be followed. But understanding that folks in the community may not have as much confidence as I do, we have put together an effort to create an outside watchdog, a super watchdog, if you will, a watchdog coalition of organizations and trusted individuals who have agreed together that they will monitor from the outside, and if they get any indication of a violation of census data confidentiality, they will use all of their collective powers from the outside of government to step in to prevent any violation of census data confidentiality. Again, I'm confident there won't be any breach of census confidentiality in the government, but this is to reassure the public that if they have any suspicions of such a breach, there are folks from the outside, including former elected officials and the like, who are ready to use their powers, including litigation, to step in. So MALDEF and the Leadership Conference are leading this effort, and we'll go public with our coalition members, a super watchdog, if you will, sometime this month, just to reassure the public that even if you don't trust that the law will be followed, folks outside of government have their eyes very clearly on ensuring that data confidentiality is maintained. That said, I do want to, because this is a CLE presentation, talk about a couple of legal cases that are currently pending that are not in the headlines yet, but the danger is that they could confuse folks if developments in either of these cases reach the headlines or some level of public attention and concern. So first, you as lawyers should be aware that there is currently pending litigation in Alabama in federal district court brought by the state of Alabama and one of its Congress members seeking to force the Census Bureau, before it provides those reapportionment numbers that Tim mentioned will be provided by the end of 2020. And those are the numbers comparing the states and their relative growth that determine how the 435 seats in the House of Representatives will be redistributed for the course of the next decade. But Alabama contends that the Bureau is required, after it completes its count through the census questionnaire, to then subtract from each state's population an estimate of the undocumented immigrant population and subtract that population before determining how the 435 seats in the House of Representatives will be distributed. That case is currently pending. It is being opposed by the administration, and a number of organizations, including MALDEF on behalf of individuals and organizations, have intervened to join in defending against the state of Alabama's contention. I'm confident that we will prevail and that every person will be included in the apportionment count. The danger, as I'm sure you all understand, is that this issue, if it becomes more publicly aware, the public becomes more aware of it, may lead some people to reach incorrect conclusions about the census. So let me bottom line it. Every person in every household, regardless of citizenship, regardless of immigration status, is to be counted in Census 2020. Not only do they have the right to be counted, they have the obligation to be counted. And the Bureau does not collect, through Census 2020 questionnaire, as you've heard, information about citizenship or immigration status. Moreover, all of the information about names, relationships, and address cannot be shared as a result of Title 13's ironclad protections with anyone for 72 years. All the Bureau can do is collect the data, collate it, and produce the statistical information that it is expected to produce about the population of our country. Indeed, the Census Bureau goes beyond that and is right now working out a differential privacy protocol to ensure that no one can look at aggregate statistical data and accurately determine the specific characteristics of any individual household. They're doing that because they believe that is their obligation under Title 13. The second case you should be aware of, again, not much in the headlines, but could end up there and could confuse some folks who ask you about Census 2020 about who should be counted. And that is a case that MALDEF and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, my organization and Terry's organization, have brought against the federal government as a result of an executive order directing the Census Bureau to collect administrative records from state and federal government to put together a database of citizenship on the population in the United States. Now, that is not a part of Census 2020, but it is being conducted by the Census Bureau. So at some point, there may be headline news about the Bureau obtaining state-level records related to citizenship. We know already that Nebraska's DMV has agreed to share certain data, and that certainly made it to the news. But that case is challenging the legality of the executive order and the directive to collect those records about citizenship. But to the extent that case ends up in the headlines at any point in the next several months, you should again be confident and express to your clients or anyone else who asks that that has nothing whatsoever to do with Census 2020. As we've now said a number of times, there is no citizenship question on Census 2020. As Tim went over, it's not there in the short form that all of us will receive and be expected to complete on behalf of our households. There is no question about immigration status in Census 2020. And once more, every individual person as a part of the household has not just the right, but the obligation to be counted in Census 2020, regardless of their citizenship or immigration status. I think that's an important message that you can help to convey to your clients, family members, neighbors, who others may inquire. Let me just, before we open to further questions, reiterate the importance of the confidentiality and safety message. Tim began by pointing out to us the three important messages that we all want to convey to anyone. That first of all, participating in Census 2020 is simple. It's a short form. You have all of this information readily available to you at your fingertips that you can provide in any of three ways, as Tim pointed out, online, by phone, or if you wait long enough, by a paper questionnaire. Second, that it is important to participate in Census 2020 because of the ramifications it has for political representation, not just the redistribution of those 435 seats in the House of Representatives, but also how our districts at state and local level are redrawn through the 2021 redistricting process. It's also important, as Terry and Tim have pointed out, because a huge amount of federal funding, billions, indeed trillions of dollars over the course of the decade, are distributed based on census data. So if people aren't counted or there's significant undercount in any community, that means we will inaccurately direct our resources and they won't be received by the communities that warrant them. And the third and most important message I would say this year is, once more, that participating in Census 2020 is safe and secure because of the very ironclad Title 13 protections on confidentiality. With that, Allie, I'm going to turn to questions. I don't know if you want to remind folks about how to participate in the Q&A.
Sure. So with your control panel, you should select the Q&A function and then submit any questions. We've received quite a few so far.
All right. Yes, we have. So let me begin. First question, can census information be obtained via FOIA or by researchers? And I will turn to Tim, but I will first say the answer is a clear-cut no. Not for 72 years. No FOIA request is going to obtain any individual household data, and no researcher can access individual household data for 72 years. That does mean, for example, that 1940 census data per household is now available. So if you want to go and look at your ancestors and how they might have responded to the census in 1940 or before, you can do that. But until 72 years have passed, information collected in the 2020 census, meaning 2092, will not be available to researchers or by FOIA. Tim, would you like to add anything?
Tom, thank you. You've answered it far better than I could. Absolutely not FOIAble. And for the very reasons you mentioned, Title 13 mandates that the data remain confidential. Our systems don't permit it. Our processes don't permit it. And we do not provide anything outside of the Bureau.
Thank you. Then, Tim, we have a couple of questions about group quarters. I wonder if you could talk about how the Bureau counts those who are staying in group quarters. And there's a more specific question about how should college and boarding school students be counted?
Yeah, a great question. So earlier I had focused on addresses, regular housing unit addresses, but there's a whole universe of what we call group quarters, places where people live or stay most of the time, that dormitories, prisons, jails, nursing homes, a lot of varieties of these group homes. We conduct the census of these locations primarily during the month of late March and into April. We send census takers to each location, and the process of counting folks in these locations is different options. People can do an e-response with us, where they'll provide an administrative file that we are able to upload into our system on behalf of their residents, or they can have us literally come into the facility and do face-to-face interviews with the residents, or, and this is probably the more common way that group quarters will work with us, we will drop off blank questionnaires with envelopes. They distribute them to their residents. After a few days, they pick up completed questionnaires from each resident in sealed envelopes. We return and pick those up, and then they go through a processing process. I will mention, you know, with the coronavirus occurring in various locations throughout the United States right now, we are actively seeking out with group quarters facilities throughout the nation, particularly in targeted high impact areas, urging them to reconsider how we collect the information from them, and suggesting to them and seeking a concurrence that they would consider an e-response. So that would, if they chose that, it would further limit the need for a census staff person to physically go to a facility and collect the information. It's a work in progress.
Great. So I think, thank you, Tim. I think that answers another question, which is how will census workers be protected from the virus? It sounds like you're already taking steps to ensure that those who would be responsible for in-person group quarters counts might be protected. And I think it's important to emphasize, as you said earlier, the easiest way for anyone who's concerned about someone coming to their door, a census taker, at any point, is to respond online or by phone, or to submit the paper questionnaire well in advance of when census takers go out into the community. That's the best way, whether the fear is based on the virus or is based on someone pretending to be a census taker who's not really a census taker. But I wonder, Tim, if you could talk a bit about how to verify, if someone does come to your door, that they are in fact an official census taker.
Yeah, so every census taker that will be visiting households or group quarters, they will have a badge with them. It will actually look like this. It'll be horizontal, not vertical, and it'll have their photo. They'll have some census literature with them. They'll have a census bag with them, and they are required upon, beginning any conversation with the respondent to identify themselves as a census employee, show their badge, and provide a brief sheet of paper to each respondent describing why they're there and the legal basis for that. So we know that every census there are sometimes nefarious activities that occur in various localities. We are urging people just to be very aware if they think they are being scammed, if they think there is somebody who's a fake and not a real census employee. Number one, call 911, report it. Second, contact us. Just go to our 2020 census.gov site. There'll be an easy access to notify us of your concern. We will then take appropriate action.
And Terry, would you like to talk a bit about the hotlines and their availability for concerns like these about census takers coming out, or how to ensure that someone doesn't come to your door? Need to unmute, Terry.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you for letting me know that I was still muted. Yeah, so the census hotlines, the numbers that were shared previously are up and running now, are available to take questions in language, English, and can address these issues, concerns about people coming to the door, perhaps concerns about, if a raid is going on, or, they think that people are maybe trying to scam people for information. We have certainly heard about incidences in the field where people have gone around purporting to be census takers and collecting information. I think the points that Tim had made earlier with respect to what is and as important what's not on the census form is something that's helpful for people to understand. So again, no social security numbers, no bank account numbers, a lot of the data points that identity thieves usually would look for are things that are not being asked on the census form. So the hotlines are available not just for folks in the field, but if you are talking to a client and you have some questions, please do feel free to call the hotlines to get some clarification, as well as looking at the vast amount of resources out there on all these types of topics.
Great, thank you. So Tim, we have a question about an individual this fall claiming to be a census taker. Could you talk a bit about what the census may have been doing out in the field to prepare for Census 2020?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So in the late summer and early fall of 2019, we deployed about 32,000 or so temporary census employees. They were updating our addresses and our mapping in local areas where we needed to make sure the list was accurate before we do the mail out, which is obviously occurring in a few days. The other thing that, and I just mentioned this, we conduct literally dozens of surveys throughout the nation every month of every year. Some are by in-person household visits, such as the American Community Survey, Current Population Survey, National Crime Victimization Survey, American Housing Survey, and so forth, as well as through the mail. These surveys are very important. They're very small sample sizes when you compare them to the whole nation's population, but there will be people that will be in these various surveys, even while we're conducting the 2020 census. And what I would encourage people to do if they receive something that is from the Census Bureau, or they think it is, but it's not what they're hearing about in the advertising and the various promotional materials about the 2020, simply go to our website, census.gov, www.census.gov. There's a tab on the main page for respondents, people that are in our surveys, and they can double check to see if it's legitimate.
Thank you, Tim. And I failed to answer a separate question. You talked a bit about that a child who is in a college dormitory would be counted there and not at home. But could you talk a bit about how kids in foster care will be counted? Are they included in the households where they're being fostered?
Absolutely. If a child in foster care is living or sleeping most of the time with a foster family, that's where they should be counted.
And that would be the relationship that they would list on the form for that household.
Correct. Correct. I mean, when you complete what I'll call the roster on the form for your household, there's each person other than yourself filling out the form. You indicate how they're connected to you, how they're related to you, and a foster child is one of those options that somebody could select.
Great. So it's there ready for them. So Tim, another question, a couple of questions actually about what if someone has two different domiciles? They have a home in Florida and one in New York, or they have a home in Arizona and one in Chicago. What do they do in responding to a message to report both addresses?
So a couple of things that will help guide people in knowing where they should be counted. The first question to ask is, where do they live or sleep most of the time? And wherever that is, that's where they should be counted. The second thing is, if somebody, let's say, literally lives 6 months out of the year at one address and 6 months of the year at a different address, it was literally equal, then you would just use the census reference day, April 1st, to break the tie and to be counted at that address. The other thing, and I think this is just more common sense information, where one is counted is not based on where they are registered to vote, on where their driver's license says they live. Those are not applicable into where somebody should be counted. It is literally where one lives or sleeps most of the time.
And to reiterate, moreover, the Census Bureau could not share anything provided in the census with either the Department of Motor Vehicles or your voter registrar. So no one's going to connect the dots and say you don't actually live where you're registered to vote, or connect the dots and say you don't actually live where DMV and maybe your insurance company think you live. The census is going to take the data and keep it ironclad, shut down for 72 years.
Thank you. That's right.
So Terry, Tim, there's a question about the questionnaire. The question is that some of the questions might be viewed as intrusive, particularly those related to income or race. What is the bare minimum information that must be provided to the census? So we talked previously about there being a legal obligation to complete the census form, but maybe Tim, you could talk about what in practice occurs if someone doesn't answer certain questions.
So you are absolutely right, Tom. It's required by law to answer the census, and that in legal terms, that means the entire form, all of the questions that are asked. In practice, we urge everyone to answer all of the questions. For example, the race and the Hispanic origin questions are critical for the Voting Rights Act, and to be able to work that Voting Rights Act appropriately throughout the nation. So race and Hispanic origin are critical. Same with age. When the data is put out, the 18 and over, the voting age population, is critical for the Voting Rights Act and many other programs as well. So when you look at it from that perspective, every question is really important. When people go through the online response form, if they try to skip a question, a pop-up box will appear and saying, hey, you missed this question, please go fill it out. If they continue going past that particular question without answering it, it will permit you. it will permit you to continue through the form without answering a particular question. We don't encourage that. We build the instrument so generally most people are going to answer all the questions. It's just how human minds work with an online instrument. But ultimately, we will get as much information as we can reasonably from every household.
So, and Tim, this gives me a chance to ask you another question, which is the phone number for the phone response option. But talk a bit about if somebody chooses to respond by phone and they don't want to answer a question, is the operator still going to let them move forward on the phone? Just as you said online, there's no stop logic that's going to prevent you from skipping a question if you are committed to skipping that question.
So the phone operators, they are Census folks that take the same oath that I do, and all other Census folks. They use the same instrument essentially as the public uses when they go in and self-respond. So I'm certain that these phone operators will encourage a full response to every question, but just like the online response, you know, they will get what they can from each caller. Keep in mind too, though, that most people who are going to call an 800 number, there's some reason they're calling and they're probably highly motivated to some extent. And so our experience on the incoming phone responses, the data is actually pretty complete.
And if I could, just to respond to the first question, Tom, with respect to the questions and feeling some of them may be slightly intrusive, I did want to flag, as Tim mentioned, that of course the Bureau is also taking a number of surveys, including the American Community Survey that was more or less very comparable to what was asked on the long form in previous censuses. And I did just want to point out that that we do know that the practice has been that if people skip questions, they skip questions, right? But that it's also important to note that each question that's on the American Community Survey is on there for a reason, right? It's not just pure interest on it, but it's tied to some type of federal program or some type of funding formula, or it's actually required in statute. So each question that's asked on the American Community Survey, and it is, you know, the questions are being reviewed on a constant basis to make sure that they're still needed, and that information perhaps can't be collected some other way. So I did just want to put the plug that there is a reason these questions exist, and that we do, of course, encourage people to provide responses to the extent to which they're comfortable. So I'll give you an example. On the American Community Survey, there is actually a question around citizenship, which is useful for Voting Rights Act purposes. And so we do need people to respond in those instances to the question. So just wanted to give a little more nuance to that.
Thank you, Terry. I also wanted to point out that Terry indicated that one effective message has to do with civil rights enforcement. And I think Tim correctly pointed out that getting the answers on race and Hispanic origin answered as completely as possible by all respondents is really important to those civil rights enforcement efforts. We need to know where populations are concentrated in order to ensure that the resources are directed toward ensuring compliance with the Voting Rights Act, with laws against employment discrimination, against housing discrimination, against government discrimination of all kinds. And I did want to pause and point out to folks, in case the question comes to you, that once more in Census 2020, even though many of us expected that it might be different this year, I think when 2030 comes around, we'll end up with a single question. But over the course of the last decade, the Census Bureau studied very carefully whether it should unify the race question and the Hispanic origin question. And it was moving toward a single question that would ask, essentially, what is the race or ethnicity of each member of the household? However, it has been directed to revert to what was used in every census previously, which is two different questions. So everyone will be asked first, is each individual in the household of Hispanic origin, yes or no? And then asked to provide some more specific information about that Hispanic origin. And then there will be a separate question about the race of each individual member of the household. And those race answers will descend based on the size in the population. And there will be another response, and there will also be a request for additional information about the specifics of the person's racial background. But once again, Census 2020 will have two questions about race and Hispanic origin first, and then race. One day, I believe we will get to a point where it will be just one question. But in case you get asked by clients or others, in Census 2020, we once more are reverting to having to answer both questions. And please answer both questions for each member of the household. So I think that this is an interesting question, Tim. Will anybody be given a sticker or other identifier essentially saying, I think we're coming out of elections, Super Tuesday in California and other places, we all got the lovely I voted stickers to wear proudly on the day that we voted, whether that was beforehand or on Tuesday. But is the census going to give us a sticker that says we've complied with our obligation to fill out the questionnaire?
Well, actually, I love the question, but you know, the way we're collecting the data is primarily online or over the phone. And so I think in those instances, it would be hard to get a sticker to somebody to proudly wear that they had answered the question. So no, we're not providing that.
And I think it's also important to note that some folks might want to not have known their participation in the census, though they should comply with their legal obligation to do so. And that may be because there may be nefarious folks who will try to convince certain households that they shouldn't be counted. Either they will say only citizens should be counted, or they'll say only people who are over a certain age should be counted. That's all false information, misinformation. Every household has the obligation and the opportunity to participate in Census 2020 by including every member of the household from the youngest to the oldest, regardless of status, regardless of citizenship. So important once again to reiterate that message. You can do so and have an obligation to do so with confidence in the safety and confidentiality of your responses. So Terry, I'm going to start with you. We have the question, will the Census Bureau's ads clarify that there is not a citizenship question? Then I'll turn to Tim, but maybe you'll talk a bit about some of the other messaging, not from the Census Bureau itself, but from others about the presence, or more importantly, the absence of a citizenship question.
Thanks, Tom. So I think one thing that is important to think about is that while we know a lot have heard about the citizenship question and have, you know, questions raised or concerns raised, there are also a lot who haven't. And so it is a fine line to try to walk when trying to assure people that there's no citizenship question and not bring the issue up in someone's mind who hasn't already been thinking about this. So I know the most recent conversations that I've had, which are probably, or definitely not going to be as recent as what Tim has had, was that the Census Bureau wasn't intending to have very explicit, there's no citizenship question on the census type ads. One of the ways that we've talked about from groups on the outside have talked about the issue is to maybe message, as Tim did earlier, this is what the census will not ask about, right? And citizenship would be one of a number of different things, so that it's not highlighted as you know, lifted up as the only thing, but sort of slipped in for those who are attuned to it to pick up on the fact that there is no citizenship question in the work. So I know that it is one issue that we're working on, potentially doing maybe some potential rapid response or targeted type of engagement to really try to get at that.
Tim, did you want to add anything?
So I just to kind of add into what Terry said, you know, we have very clearly put on our 2020 census.gov website, you know, the clarification, there is no citizenship question on the form. And we've also indicated on our website some of the other things that I noted in this presentation that will not be asked on the form. Banking account information, social security number, political donations, etc. To add though to what Terry just shared. When we have done the research in the past, literally over the last year, the thing that resonated the most with people was why does participating, why does it benefit me? And in some communities, why does it benefit my community? So we found through that research highlighting the no citizenship specific question actually could have a negative effect. Just as Terry said, it would raise a specter of an issue that they may not even know about. So that's how our advertising is approaching it, emphasizing the benefits, the importance, and the safety of one's response, and then pivoting in that advertising to how easy it is to participate.
Great. So we have a question, what is the penalty if one fails to complete the census? And I'll begin by saying, of course, there is a statutory obligation for every household to complete the census to participate in the 2020 count of all persons residing in the United States. But I would say the main penalty is simply that your community will be inadequately represented, both in the House of Representatives and in other politically selected bodies through the redistricting process. And your community could sacrifice some of the funding that should be directed to it if you fail to complete the census. In practical terms, I would say the loss of those very palpable benefits with real impacts in your neighborhoods is the main penalty if one fails to complete the census, or I would add, fails to complete the census accurately by including every member of the household from the youngest to the oldest. But Terry or Tim, would you like to add to the question, what is the penalty if one fails to complete the census?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think you have really eloquently said the real loss by not participating. And another way I say a similar thing is if you don't respond or include everybody in your household that lives or sleeps most of the time in your household, you're throwing away money. You're throwing away money, and some other community is going to get that portion because you haven't been willing to be counted. The other thing I'll just mention, I'm sure you folks are attorneys, so you're probably very aware of this. The Census Bureau is not a law enforcement agency. So if somebody were to, very visibly and publicly say, I'm not going to respond, I'm going to break the law, our obligation is to report that to the Department of Justice. And then, of course, they would evaluate, is that an instance where they want to press charges and pursue a case against said individual. Our experience has been that is not really a helpful way to gain cooperation of the American people by asking justice to prosecute and so forth. So that's why we emphasize the benefits and we emphasize the importance of participating.
Great.
And Tom, I like the way you, stated the penalty, the real life, impact of not participating. I did want to just flag that the most recent analysis done by Professor Andrew Reamer at George Washington University tagged about $1.5 trillion being allocated from the federal government to the states based on census data in some way, shape, or form. So when you count that up over 10 years, recognizing that amount is going to increase on an annual basis, then you really start to get a sense of the penalty or the impact of not participating. And I would just flag that Professor Andrew Reamer also has some information based on a state-by-state basis. So if people were interested in understanding exactly how much their state might be getting across some different programs, federal programs, that information is available out there.
Thank you. So Tim, there's a question about overcounts. So does the Bureau do anything to ensure that someone doesn't double count by responding for two different households, as we talked about previously?
Awesome question. So in the back end processing, there's an automatic matching system to see if one household's names and the characteristics of the reported persons is a match or a near match to other households anywhere else in the country. If they are, some indication that this could be a duplicate answer, then that is flagged in the system, and then a human being literally looks at that to determine is it two responses for the same place, or is it in fact two different households. Sometimes that will prompt a phone call from a census employee to the said household asking to get clarification. So we've got some pretty amazing back-end processes. Actually, I would say compared to prior censuses, they're much, much better than they've ever been. And that gives me some hope that populations that in the past have typically been overcounted to some level, particularly non-Hispanic white populations, homeowner populations, I have much more confidence that this census, that overcount will be substantially reduced and will make the playing field much more accurate in terms of accuracy on the whole undercount, overcount situation.
Thank you, Tim. And our last question is about cybersecurity. So what protections have been put in place to ensure that data is protected from a breach directed from anywhere in the world at census, confidential census data?
So I assume that's coming to me.
Yes.
And what I would just like to say is, I'm not an IT person, but I'm certainly in the loop as one of the census executives about our systems. Several things to know. One is when people go to our online response instrument, when they hit the send, their data is encrypted while it's moving, and once it arrives, it's also encrypted at rest. The second thing, we have blocks in our system, so one needs to be, a response needs to be emanating from somewhere within the United States. We do not accept URLs from outside of the country. I will say that from a cybersecurity vantage point, this is one thing that myself, I'm not losing sleep over. There are so many firewalls built into our segmented system. There's 24/7 monitoring, both from a IT, automated perspective that will flag and shut down segments of our system if there's an attack, to actually eyes watching 24/7, human eyes managing and monitoring all of these things. So that's one thing that doesn't particularly
Great.
worry me.
Thank you, Tim. I think we're about out of time. I will take the moderator's prerogative to just close by reiterating a thank you to all of you for joining us and urging you to feel empowered to respond to questions from clients, neighbors, family members about Census 2020. The key messages are that it's important to participate. Indeed, you are legally obligated to do so, but so many important benefits emanate from ensuring that every member of your household is counted. It is simple to participate. You've heard it's a short form for all of us in 2020, and information that you have off the top of your head with respect to those who live with you. And finally, and perhaps most important in this contentious year, that your data, all household data, is protected from being misused and being used for any purpose other than the Census Bureau statistical purposes for 72 years. Finally, I would close by reiterating one more time. Though it got a lot of attention and raised awareness of Census 2020, there is no citizenship question, there is no immigration status question, there's no question about social security number, there's no question about providing your bank information. This is basic information to ensure that our funding from the federal government is distributed appropriately, that political representation is distributed appropriately, and that we can go through the next decade assured that our government is doing best it can to serve all of the people. We provided you with some resources both within the Bureau and outside from nonprofit organizations. And in closing, I want to thank our two panelists, Tim Olson and Terry Minnis, and I want to thank our sponsors, the ABA Section on Civil Rights and Social Justice, and the Commission on Hispanic Legal Rights and Responsibilities. Thank you all.